So not everyone is coming. There's already 2 attendees, 3.
Ah, okay. That's great. Okay, seeing you. Vulcan's joining. Okay, so people coming now. Okay, I think let's
Yes.
give it. Yeah, so let's give it 5 past 7. Few minutes. I think they're only clicking on now. That's good. Yeah, 7. Okay, good. Can somebody who's joining maybe just type in the message box? I just want to see if I can read the chat. Okay, see Rajiv is
all
joining.
panelists, it's not to the audience.
No, there's 4 panelists, and 1 panelist has my name, which is, I don't know who that is, but it's okay. So, okay, people can see some of the things over there in the chat. Okay, it's 3 past 7. I think Dave, you can start in 2 minutes at 5 past 7.
Okay.
I'm just going to introduce Dave quickly, everyone. So, Dave is basically the chair of the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa, and he's ironically in Paris tonight. When I planned for this, I didn't think he would be here because it's the World Nuclear Exhibition, and we all know there's a big debate regarding the energy transition, and it's not a taboo in France to talk about nuclear power, but I think across the world we need to, just come to terms of what is nuclear and what it can do and what it can't do and things of that sort. And that's why I asked Dave to give a presentation today, and also to explain a little bit of what's happening in the African context of nuclear. So that'll be it. Yeah, Dave, if you're ready, I think you can start.
Ready.
All right. If you can share your screen at the bottom, and then.
Okay, I'll see if I can do the technology bit. Somewhere here's the technology bit. Try that. Yes, can you see that?
Yes. Just 1 second, Dave. So people, I can see your questions and answers, and I guess that's how you will do it. If you don't have answers to the chat, so just ask questions there, and then later on I can read them out. Okay. Okay, Dave, I think you can start.
You're over to me, are you, Hugo?
Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome. I just first introduced myself for who am I, and I wrote a little. So just background. My background is I joined the British Navy in 71 and was a nuclear engineer in submarines. I came out to South Africa in 84 and joined Eskom as Koeberg was being commissioned. So I was getting into the game of dealing with the new build programs of the world when they were going quite fast. You may have heard of the thing called the Pebble bed modular reactor project. I'll be a bit later on that. I'll discuss that briefly. And I ran that from 95 to 2005, and it was really the first small modular reactor. We got involved in nuclear procurement when Eskom started a program in 2007 to actually procure some more nuclear power stations, which we ran. And that started out as a major program, got to the point of end of 2008, and the financial crisis closed that down. But I stayed as a technical lead of that. And then in 2016, I became the chief nuclear officer of Eskom, which is the utility in South Africa, running 2 nuclear plants at Koeberg Power Station. And I retired in 2018 as being suitably elderly. And then I was appointed as the chairperson of the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation, which is the national laboratory, in 2020. I was the chairman of the IEA working group on light reactors from 10 to 16. I currently co-chair the technical working group on nuclear power plant operations for the IEA. I was a member of the WANO post-Fukushima design review team from 2012 to 2018, and I'm a professor of practice. So that's my background. Very strongly nuclear, still engaged in the process. What I want to just cover this evening is going through what are the real costs of nuclear projects, because part of Hugo gave me a brief, and the brief wasn't quite what the title is, so I apologize, it's not quite what you were expecting. But part of the discussion is nuclear a viable option for power generation, or is it a complete too expensive discussion? So I want to just quickly go through some topics: real cost of nuclear power projects, impact of capex and net discount rate, which I think is quite important. Can nuclear be built fast enough? The famous statement that, well, nuclear is too slow to build, so we can't possibly meet the requirements for solving the climate crisis. What's the impact of intermittency on tariff? In other words, you can't just use levelized cost of electricity as a reference. It doesn't work anymore with intermittent sources. Carbon emissions, correlation of electricity and GDP, and then a brief discussion on what small modular reactors are, which you may have heard of, and most people don't quite know what it is, and I will try and explain a bit of that. I won't try and explain all of it because it's a very broad field. And then some final thoughts. And then we'll go to questions, and I'll go back to Hugo to go to questions. So with that, let's start with the first one, which is, what are the real costs of nuclear projects? And you'll find all my slides all but one of my slides is actually basically a data set. This was Inside Business Financial Times. They did a analysis. They reported an analysis about Energy Technologies Institute, and I quote their words: an organization backed by the government and a number of energy companies, looked at 35 delivered nuclear projects in the world, and it's very interesting. They put in 4 categories. The first of a class in the USA or the European Union came in between $9,000 and $12,000 a kilowatt, and I'd argue you could make a case that Vogel came in slightly higher than that. 15% of them, however, so that's just a bit of background of the top couple of stations that came in really expensively. 15% of it came in over $5,500 a kilowatt. 45% came in $5,500 to $3,500 a kilowatt, and 40% came below $3,500 a kilowatt. And what I think comes from this is a general point, which I'll make a bit later, which is that if you look at the high-profile projects, and Flamanville 3, Olkiluoto 3, the Vogel project in the States, they have reasonably bad numbers, and they're probably not commercially viable when they're finished. But that's a very small proportion of the world's nuclear plants. So let's just look at that. And time to complete is the dominant force always when you deal with a plant. What's interesting is I did this graph a couple of years ago, but I put it in, and it's just simply the units that were commissioned across time from about 1985 through to a couple of years ago. And what's interesting is that, yes, you can see some outliers. This is duration of construction. So 60 months is sort of a reasonable number. And you can see some outliers, and everyone says, well, that's not the quote. But so the shoes, this lump in the middle is the French N4 series, which had significant problems. Kalinin 3 was a plant that was, in fact, under construction when the Soviet Union collapsed and was then completed later. So there was a big hiatus in the middle. And at the end, we got Olkiluoto and Flamanville, and I think probably underestimated their final completion dates because they've been, again, a problem. And the 2 red ones, because I'm a South African, were the Koeberg projects, and they were somewhat over time, but that was mainly because somebody put limpet mines on the pressure vessel heads and the main cable trays, and we had sabotage about a year before planned startup, which therefore put us back by about 18 months in completion. So what I'm putting this is that if you look at these graphs and you said, it is pretty safe to say that 60 months or so is a reasonable construction time for a nuclear plant. This is from first concrete to commercial operation, in terms of my IEA data. So it does tend to indicate that there are some outliers, clearly, but those outliers aren't are explainable in how they're doing. And what they show you again here in Olkiluoto and Flamanville, and also in a sense in the Shoes and Sivor plants, you're looking at first of a class European American type construction. And if you had Vogel on here, it would also be somewhat horrendous. Okay, this is also just a different graph on construction periods. And I'm harping on construction periods because it's a synonym for construction costs. If you're going to build a nuclear plant, then your problem is going to be if you mobilize your team, then most of your money is going into your team. And if you spend too long doing it, it costs too much money. It also indicates design problems. And what's fascinating in here is the construction times. This red block is what could be seen to be a reasonable period. 5 years. This isn't quite the same discussion. This includes moving on site to it, but something like 5 years is a reasonable bet. And what you can see is the French were doing pretty well until they shut the program down, and then they built the last 4 machines. And so then you've got this very bad thing out here. The US started out pretty well, and then basically just post 79, it just ran away with them. And there's a whole discussion of how it did. And then you've got the Chinese all in the bottom block, and you've got the Koreans all in the bottom block, showing you the fact that if you build a consistent program, you get into a standardized process of doing it. You want a really funny one? That first one, that one there is Calder Hall. That's Calder Hall units. And what's quite interesting about Calder Hall is that was 36 months from the cabinet in UK deciding to build Calder Hall reactor to the Queen closing the breaker. And that was 36 months. So you can do it quickly. Bit extreme, but certainly 5 years seems a reasonable number. And just in terms of what export contract cost, and I'm sticking on export contracts here because domestic contracts are somewhat difficult to dig the numbers out for. But these are the current export jobs going in the world today. Pakistan, and they rank from lowest to highest. So the Pakistan have just signed a deal with the Chinese for another HPR 1000, and that's coming in at just over $3,000 a kilowatt. India just signed for 4 more VVR 1000s, and they're coming in for 3,000. China's buying 4 VVRs 1200s from the Russians, and that's coming as 4. And I wouldn't get, one of the problems with these deals is you're quoting it from public statements, and one of the problems is that what's in the contract isn't always clear. So you get some deals where the entire project's in the contract, or it includes, for example, in the Bangladesh job down here, it includes operation of the reactor for the first year and all development costs. So that's where it stands. There's a couple of interesting ones there which are high in terms of costing. The bottom ones are interesting. The UK EPR is clearly, the UK knows that well. That's Hinkley Point C, and that's coming in at about $9,000 a kilowatt. Again, largely because the Sizewell B, so Hinkley Point C design was essentially re-engineered following the GDA. So about 30% of the design was redone. I was talking to Framatome today, and they were saying that about 30% of the design work was redone because of UK requirements being different to French requirements, which is the kind of cost. The same, the Hungarians also got the same situation. The Hungarian VVR 1200s, they've just committed to start doing those, and they're markedly more expensive than other VVRs in the table. And the reason, if you ask the Russians, is because Hungary asked to move the design codes to being more modern Western design codes, whatever that means, which meant they had to re-engineer large parts of the plant. Egyptian one's a bit of a funny one because the Egyptian one includes 2 very large desalination plants to feed it. So there we've got a figure which says the quoted costs between 3,002 is the lowest one that's been quoted, up to 9,000 for the EPR at Hinkley Point C. What's interesting is that the domestic projects in China, South Korea, Russia, and India are being quoted and referred to, given the numbers they quote, at below $3,000 a kilowatt. And in fact, the Chinese projects of the CPR 1000 series, which is the very similar to the French 3-loop Westinghouse 3-loop plants, was coming in at about $1,600, $1,800 a kilowatt. Very competitive. So the first lesson is standardize and don't keep changing it. Again, this is the same sort of thing. It looks at example of if you localize. This is the Chinese experience of equipment supply. Guangdong, Lingao, phase 1, Lingao, phase 2, and I'm not even sure what LHNP stands for. I know that's these are 2 more 4-unit sites. The degree of localization ramps up from when in Guangdong everything came from France. I think almost the rebar came from France, whereas in the more recent plants are over 85% local content. And to go with that is something else. This is the Korean OPR costs, which looks at Ying'an 3 and 4, and it's Ulchin 3 and 4, Ying'an 5 and 6, Ulchin 5 and 6, Shinkori 1 and 2, that you're looking at a very significant saving as you build more of the same. And that's being seen in UK at the moment, which is a situation between Hinkley Point C and the quotes being coming out for Sizewell C. They're looking at a significant reduction in costs. It's notable that this reduction is from an already mature nuclear building organization. So this isn't the society learning how to build nuclear power stations. It's that particular design being learned. So that's sort of a bit of background on actual cost, CapEx cost that everyone quotes, and overnight cost, but that clearly is not that's the cost the customer pays is different. And there's a key graph that it's a simple spreadsheet, it's not complicated. What this is probably one that I would argue is one of the most fundamental graphs that people are not buying into. Net discount rate is your interest rates less inflation, because clearly if you buy a plant, then as you go through, your tariff increases over time with inflation. So it's inflation reduced. We have assumed plant life of 60 years, load factor 90%, O&M and fuel about $20 a megawatt hour. It's all in dollars, and the capex spending over 72 months. And what we then plotted, and I was saying earlier about the cost of plants, I've gone from $2,500 to $6,000 a kilowatt, and that's the $2,500 per kilowatt curve, which is realistically the lowest you could credibly imagine in the current scenario. And $6,000 a kilowatt, you should be about what you're paying for sort of first of a class in the country type thing with full turnkey. What's interesting is that what this axis along here is the net discount rate you're assuming. And I will let's just say that you're the state, and I'll show the graph in a second, which is from the OECD. If you say that you're the state and your cost of capital is the cost of state debt, and state debt is currently at almost zero interest rate, it has been for the last few years, it's changing now. But even now, inflation rates are equal to or higher than interest rates in most of the first world, developed in the G7. What you can start seeing at 3% real interest rate, you're $50 a megawatt hour for a $6,000 a kilowatt plant, and you're down to whatever this would be down here, sort of 35 or 34 for the 2,500. But what's interesting to point out is that and everyone say, well, that's a big difference, 50 to 34. So clearly cost really matters. What's interesting is if I then move the interest rate, because I'm now a financier and I'm claiming a 10% discount rate, which is the interest rate of a free market, highly cost competitive, then at 10% interest rate, then I've gone up from 50 to 122. And in fact, what's interesting is I've even moved the 2,500 one up to over 60, 61, 62. So what's interesting is you're realizing that you might say going from $6,000 a kilowatt as the overall project cost down to 2.5 is a really massive take on, and that's really important. But it's actually less important than whether you move the interest rate from what I would consider a low state discount rate of 3% to a reasonably straightforward commercial interest rate. And it's notable that, for example, Hinkley Point C's business case used 10% discount rate, 10% net discount rate as its valuation. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that when you're doing a nuclear project, one of the key questions to ask is always, how am I financing it and what is the cost of the finance? And it's not as simple as it seems. If you go and buy a nuclear, all those export machines on the previous 2 pages earlier, which are currently under construction, essentially we're being funded by export credit agency financing, which I'll show a bit later, is really highly competitive, to put it gently. Export credit agency financing is down here. Rate of return, internal rate of return being required by sort of a venture capitalist is up here. So who's doing it is more important than whether the plant's expensive or cheap, almost. That's why, for example, the Chinese who are functioning on this, the Russians, the Indians, and Koreans who are functioning essentially on the blue line, around here somewhere are saying nuclear is incredibly cheap and cost effective, and somebody's saying I'm privately financing a first of a class somewhere in Europe is saying it's unaffordable. And that's an important understanding that's what's changed the discussion. This is the same other version of the graph, but it comes just because you don't believe my graphs, because I'm just a simple engineer. This is the IEA, OECD's NEA project cost of generating electricity, that every 5 years that I've got the 2020 graph, and they're the same. They go out and they ask all the countries almost in the world and said, please give me the cost you assume for the capital cost of a nuclear, coal, hydro, whatever, all the plant designs you've got, and please give us the operating and maintenance cost you expect and everything else. And so it gets in, and then it calculates what actually that works out in LCOE for them. And what's interesting, and you can see the same graph here, natural gas, they say that they reckon ranges from 60 to 135. And because natural gas is very largely gas cost driven and very limitedly capital cost driven, and as you change the interest rate, then that orange blocky hardly moves. Whereas the nuclear one, which is very heavily capital driven, and it was very limited concern about the actual operating and maintenance and fuel, moves much more drastically. So if you're saying 3% discount rate, then nuclear, according to the figures the world gave the OECD, and it isn't the OECD now, it was literally they send a query to the countries and say, please give me these numbers. What you can see is that coal has a moderate increase, nuclear has a severe increase, and gas has almost no increase. So if somebody says, I'm going for 10% discount rate, then you end up saying, well, combined cycle gas turbines are least risk, and then we'll go for those. If somebody says, I'm going for 3% discount rate, then you go for nuclear. And this is why you get a situation where you get arguments over the relative cost. And of course, the reality is the actual cost of debt is down at the 3% level. So all the 10% version does is generates vast profits for the operating company. So that's just how I get through the fact that and then you say, well, what is the cost of debt? And I didn't access anything specific. I'd accessed Eskom's annual report. Eskom being a state utility with a large amount of debt, and what's got export credit agency facilities are here. That's Japan in yen, euros. There's one in ZAR, there's one in US dollars. So my earlier comment about what the interest rates were, what you can see is if you ignore the rand one, because our inflation those days was about 6% or so. What's interesting is the US average inflation was 2% over the last 10 years. I think Europeans are somewhat similar. So what you can see is that essentially, looking at these numbers here, that most of these export credit agency deals were coming in at essentially zero interest rate, 2% to zero. And classical ECA financing is we lend you the money to build the plant. When you've built it, 1 year after you built it, you start paying us back, and you pay us back for the next 18 years. So it's very much paid for by the operator of the plant. So that's sort of the financing. So I want to go back to it. So, and just of interest, an example of this is Egypt, which was lent that project I mentioned earlier, that 4-unit plant they're building, they were lent $25 billion by the Russians at this is a quote from Reuters. So, and they gazetted this, and in their gazette, they said a 3% interest rate. Now, if dollar inflation is 2%, and it's been much more than that the last couple of years, this would imply that in real terms, the Egyptians are paying a 1% cost of capital to build their nuclear plant. And if you look at 1%, it isn't even on my graph earlier on, which again is why you've got this discussion about economics. But then everyone says, well, that's all very good, but you just cannot build them fast enough. Now, I've showed the other graph of actual construction schedules because that drives cost. Can we roll them out fast enough? And what's very interesting is that this is an assumption everyone's got, that that if you're going to solve the climate crisis, it's going to have to be done by rapidly rolloutable things. Well, this actually was a study in 2016, but it's on Science magazine, and it was based on the BP's annual economic study. And what's interesting is that what you can see is this is kilowatt hours per capita per year added annually over a 10-year period. And the blue bits are nuclear. and the other bits are wind and solar. That's wind and solar. And what you can see is anyone saying, well, no, you can't do nuclear fast enough because wind and solar, well, that so quickly just is not showing truth. And it's the same now if you look at the graph in Abu Dhabi, who are just commissioning this early next year, they'll be commissioning their 4 nuclear reactors. You can see the fact that the Abu Dhabi, the rate at which they rolled out their nuclear fleet in terms of kilowatt hours per year has dwarfed anything else they've done. It's just it's almost a vertical line. 1 unit a year for 4 years, 1,400 megawatts. This is a country level example. This is the French and is well known. But there's the French example. So if someone says we can't do it fast enough, the French made the decision on really building an expanded nuclear fleet in about 72. And by 84, they'd brought they'd reduced their fossil fuels from well, I go to the peak of, let's say, up to 70% of their demand down to 9.5% of their demand. That's a real example. French are really doing it today, or did it today. And of course, the French have now gone back to that. I mean, I was at the conference today, and the French are saying now that they've committed to 6 reactors with 8 more being planned. So they're looking at 14 new reactors. The rate they say of 1 a year, but I think they're going to do more than that. So that's those sort of issues. And then someone says, well, still the renewables are cheaper and all is wonderful and great. Well, that's not quite true. Again, I'm sitting in Europe now. I'm speaking to Europeans. And if you look at energy, you've got to be very careful to say not what is the apparent levelized cost of energy from a power source, because that's actually not relevant with intermittency. What you can do is you can just simply do a simple plot. You just take the actual tariff the country's charging, and you look at how much renewable they've got there, and you see, is there a correlation? And there is a correlation. It is that the more renewables you've got in your grid, the more it costs. And this has been increasingly seen across the world. And I could talk extensively about the fact that people are slightly fudging numbers here. Let me just explain that a bit more. In South Africa, we had an energy policy which is being revised, and we expect to get out for draft probably next week or so. But the first one in 2019, or the last one, said, oh no, we actually think that the cost of putting in grid systems for renewables is about the same as any other energy source. So they very carefully and very nicely said, we will ignore that cost. They're now saying, oh, surprise, surprise, the cost of upgrading the grid to move away from centralized power stations to distributed power stations is about 200 billion rand. Now, what's that? That's a let's say 10 billion pounds, that kind of number. But the way to look at it is just look at the actual cost of the state is charging individuals and the cost of the thing. Another one is just, this is on a chart on it, but this is simply on a more international one. This is the US EIA in this year. The price in terms across the bottom in terms of US cents per kilowatt hour versus the wind and solar share, and you sort of get a nice little graph there. I would argue that I haven't got a correlation there, but I'd argue there's a pretty strong correlation that the more you put renewables in, the more things get exciting. And this is all, well, part of this, there's 2 more graphs in this section I'll just go through. Part of this is what's called the duck curve. And in fact, it's now been called the canyon by some people. There's a new name for it being, it's called the canyon. And what it is that if you look at what happened classically, you had a demand profile which would low overnight, rise in the morning, dip slightly, be quite high through the day, and then rise in the evening. That's simply people going. So in the morning, people getting up, showering, going to work, having breakfast. And in the evening is people actually coming home, turning on the heaters or the stove and cooking things. But of course, if you put solar into this process, solar comes into the system when the sun's rising, which is not in the morning or the evening, it's in the middle of the day. And what you're seeing, and this is a lovely duck curve, it's got a duck in it, which I quite like it. But the real bit about this one is that this is Western Australia. And this is AMEO is the Australian Grid Management Agency, and I forget what the M stands for, but it's the grid. It's the Australian sort of grid operator, and this is what they're saying they're seeing where they're going. And what you can see is because they've got lots of solar in the Western Australian grid, and the same graph exists for the Australian grids. What you see is at night there's no impact. So the graph that goes from evening peak through to the morning is the same as the old graph. In other words, you've got a high demand in the evening and it goes down during the night. But rather than rising in the day, it's now collapsing. And in fact, they're now in a situation where about here, where in fact they're getting right down at the bottom. And there's three problems that brings you. The first problem it brings you, or two problems. It brings you a stability problem because you've then not got enough running machinery that is synchronous generation. You're running inverter-based machines. You need to add more things like synchronous condensers to your system, which adds money, but no one mentions that. And the other one is, so that's the first one. The second one you're now seeing is the ramp rate that's being required of the systems on the grid. This dispatcher is getting more and more steep, and therefore more demands on them. And lastly, you've got a situation where the tariff, you still need all the power you used to need up here. You will note that 2024 is a higher evening peak because of growth than 2018, but the daily one is less. So you still need all the dispatchable plant for the evening peak, but you've not got any income to cover it. This is being seen. And when you put all these thoughts together, you end up with some interesting graph that when somebody says to you that the renewables are cheaper, you should bear this graph. This is again an OECD study, NEA 2018, so it's quite recent. I mean, 5 years ago. What happened was 6 countries. It was the 6 countries had studied what was the grid cost of putting different technology into the system. And let me try and explain this in some detail. So what they're saying is if you've got 10% of your grid supplied by gas, the gas implies, versus some infinitely beautiful system which has no power stations, it implies a very small, let's say 50 cents, something down here, increase on your costs of running the transmission system and everything else. And the reason for that is simple. Your gas units tend to be closer to the load centers that you've got them on, and therefore the grid doesn't need much changing, and it really is a non-event. Then you get to coal, and that gets slightly worse, and that gets slightly worse because coal stations tend to be on the coal field, which is further away from the load, so your grid has to be strengthened. And these are all connection costs, you can see that, because the grid has to be connection. And then you've got the nuclear, which is higher again, still pretty trivial, because nuclear literally has two requirements. One is a requirement it's not normally some way away from the loads, and also the fact that you require stability of supply to the nuclear station for safety. So you end up with the cost of ensuring N-1 type compliance with a higher confidence you have for coal. So that's why those are there, and that's why and that's just things. And this is small numbers. What's fascinating is this. Now let's understand this increase in price is not the price added to the cost coming from the source. It is the overall increase in price. So if you've got onshore wind and you've got 10% of your grid supplied by onshore wind, you have a $15 a megawatt hour average increase to your cost to the customer, not from the wind generation, but from the grid and backup requirements you've got to do. So you've got to keep gas turbines running. And what you start seeing is that offshore wind ends up with something like $40 a megawatt hour if you're running 30%. And commercial PV is more expensive than residential PV, and that's because it tends to be its location. It does need a separate grid. And we have that in South Africa, where the commercial PV plants are in a place called the Northern Cape, which is a wonderful piece of desert. In other words, there's no load there and the power lines have to come into the main centers. Whereas residential PV, it's on your roof, so it's got other problems like that duct curve, but in fact it's lowest. So what you're seeing here is that the missing thing in a levelized cost of energy is these costs here. Now, we can argue these costs are unreasonable, but it seems to get backed up. When you look at the actual numbers coming out of the world, that graph, it seems to be showing us that there is a substantial increase. Now, bearing in mind that something like if you go back a little bit, I'm going to go back to 3 curves. Pardon me, go back on my graph. I should have been whatever. We're talking in the logical sense, something like 50 to $71 a megawatt hour is a reasonable cost for electric power from a nuclear power station. We are saying here that the average cost to put a semi-renewable system in, the grid strengthening and the grid backup and the balancing costs are close to the cost of what just nuclear power is. So that's sort of the full cost discussion. But don't worry, I'm sure someone will say to me that don't worry because we're going to save the world's carbon emissions by doing this. Because clearly carbon emissions, the target reduction of carbon emissions. Yeah, okay. So this is a analysis of using electricity map, and it's based on a 1 hourly reference. I'll show another graph of this in a second. And it says what's the carbon intensity ranked by median value in summer 2017. It hasn't changed really much. In fact, the Germans have got worse. Just of interest, so all the good people are down here and the bad people over here. So Poland's pretty awful. We know Poland's massively doing coal. We know that. And so there's Poland. Occasionally it's really low for some reason, but almost always it's sitting up here, very close to the top because it's running coal stations and it's basically a coal station. Probably South Africa's quite similar to that, I think. Here we've got Norway, which is brilliant because it's running hydro and occasionally running a couple of gas turbines, but it's really brilliant. And what you can therefore look at is, yeah, there's Poland. We know that's the coal people. There's Germany. With all the money and effort they've done to get rid of their nuclear and decarbonize, they are in the bad end of the regime. And down here, we've got Austria, which is big and hydro. We've got Belgium, which is, in fact, 60% nuclear. They're now closing the nuclear plants and replacing it with natural gas from Russia, I think. Interesting concept. Finland, which is essentially has got a fair chunk of nuclear and a fair chunk of hydro. Switzerland, which actually is hydro and nuclear. France, we know France is nuclear, and you can see that there's Sweden, which is half nuclear, half hydro. Well, third nuclear, third hydro, and everything else, and then Norway. So if somebody says to you, but we're doing these renewables because it's going to help us get the carbon emissions down, it doesn't seem to be working too well. This is a better graph. This is the same graph in a different way. This is actually 2021, I think. What's interesting here is this is a plot where for each of the countries mentioned, for every hour of the 8,760 hours a year, they plotted the point is where how much generation hour they made in that hour and how much CO2 they emitted. Because this electricity map is a brilliant system, does this for you. I mean, this is the extracted data. What you can see here is that clearly France is a big user of electricity. You can see it's nuclear, and you can see it's right down the bottom over here. This is Germany. This is Poland. This here is Italy. Spain is down here, and Spain is interesting. It's got a lot of renewables, and it's got renewables, natural gas, and some nuclear. There's Sweden down here. There's Norway, nice flat line. There's Switzerland, and here you can see there's Denmark, which is interesting because Denmark is a massive wind source. We all know this, but also Denmark is linked to its neighboring grids. Denmark, on average, imports and exports as much power as it uses. So on average, Denmark, if every kilowatt hour it's using, it's imported or exported a kilowatt hour. So it's really a subset of the neighboring grids. And then again, sometimes it's importing heavily. There's no wind. It's importing heavily from Poland, for example, in which case it's up here. And sometimes the wind's blowing beautifully and it's down here quite low. Then we've got Portugal, which is, I'm not sure, and then Belgium. So what you can see clearly is that if the answer is that putting in renewables is going to solve the problem and bring us down on the curve, it doesn't appear to be working too well. France is nuclear. Norway is massively hydro. Sweden is half nuclear. Switzerland is half nuclear. And that's an interesting discussion. Just two last graphs. I've been going a bit too long. I've got a bit of discussion of and then I'll open for questions. Correlation of electricity and GDP. This is just a single graph. This just says if somebody tells to you that we can we can go on industrializing and have a good economy with lots and with less electricity, that is a nice correlation, I would argue, and that says that energy consumption per person, and that's currently barrels of oil equivalent, BOE, but in fact that will have to become, in a carbon-free world, that's got to become electrically based. Then what you're looking at is the log scale on the left, log scale both ways, and you can see basically it's pretty clear that if you want to have a high GDP, which is high quality of life, you'd have a high consumption. And there is nobody sitting over here. There is nobody in here. There is nobody sitting over here and saying, I can function with low energy consumption and with a high standard of living. So that's sort of the thing. So those are some highlights I just put. That's the cost of capital we discussed briefly, where we should be. And I think the Europeans have got to get on the stage of a serious construction program. They will get the prices down. The French, when they ran their nuclear program in the 70s and the 80s, were down where the Chinese are today. But if you build one machine and then you wait 5 years and build another machine, you don't have that situation. The Americans didn't standardize. That's where their costs ran away with themselves and so on. So just a quick one on what small modular reactors, and that was, and Hugo said, put small modular reactors in because it's the fashionable thing of the day. And yeah, I did start the PBMR project and I argue it's the first SMR. Let's take a brief discussion. So what are small modular reactors? You may have heard that phrase, SMRs. It's one of those fashionable things people quote and they say, we must get into SMRs. Well, let's start off with their small modular reactors, nominally less than 300 megawatts. Some are now about 500 megawatts because they're creeping up. But essentially it says, rather than going for these 1,500 megawatts behemoths, we build small machines between, let's say, 50 and 300 megawatts. The concept is by making them smaller, you don't build them on site. You basically build everything in a factory and you ship it out and dump it in the plant that way. So you can have mass production like building a motor car. If you built a motor car at home in your garage, it would cost you a fortune and wouldn't be very good. If you build a motor, you build it. There are three types. The range of the large grid is, let's say, the 200, 300 megawatt jobs linked into large grids trying to compete with the rest of the things. So when someone puts a small, when the French are going to build a reactor in that 2030, 35, called the NEWARD, and that's going to be linked into the grid. So it's competing with the main grid. Small grid is somewhere like Africa, and I won't go into detail in Africa, but the big issue in Africa is that our grids are very small, so you can't put 1,000 megawatt machines on them. If the grid's only 400 megawatts of demand, you've got to put in there a 50 megawatt machine is all you can really put into it. And so there's a smaller size that does that, and there's off-grid, which are, let's say, as low as a megawatt, and they're ones that very much are being pushed by the Canadians and the Russians, by the Canadians, because you've got the vast Siberia and the tundra and the whole north of Canada, where there will never be a grid. And you've got your town fed at the moment by diesel fuel and diesel generator. So you're competing with diesel generator. So the costs are much lower, but the problem of moving the diesel in. They're all claiming to be passively and inherently safe. This means they're basically that you can let your grandchildren play with them, and they might destroy the investment, but they won't hurt any people. They're claiming standardization, reduced operating maintenance costs. And again, that seems logical, but we haven't got any of them running really, so we can't answer that question too well. Carbon-free baseload, that's the exciting thing. And synergy with renewables, that's a little bit of a sales campaign everyone puts out, which says we can load follow with renewables, and all these small reactors can load follow. But the problem is that if you've got enough nuclear power to match your peak demand, because you must have enough baseload to meet your peak demand, then the problem that you've got is that your wind or your solar is then competing not with the total cost of the nuclear plant, but with the avoidable cost, which is actually the cost of the fuel. And the cost of the fuel on a nuclear plant is obscenely small. So essentially, you end up, if you do put SMRs into a fleet with renewables, you will find the SMRs will optimize the renewables out of the picture because their costs are higher than the fuel cost of nuclear. Other one is important is that you want to go, because the SMRs are, and the modular almost means more that you don't build a single big machine, you might build 10 small machines, and I'll show in a second, that you want to have something which is a single operating team. And that's the thing for the nuclear organization. We classically have a complete operating team per reactor. And that want to get away from with this. So let's just look at what's in the world today. There's about 70 projects in the world in development. I mean, almost everyone and his mother-in-law is sorting out an SMR tech project at the moment. So what we've now got is, this is the ones in the world today, which I would argue are semi-credible. The KLT 40S is a Russian one. It's water cooled. It's in operation, and I'll show. And it's in what's called a floating reactor. But basically, it's a big submarine reactor or a big icebreaker reactor being used to make power. Works, reliable. I'm not sure the economics of it. High temperature HTRPM is in China. It's called the high temperature reactor power module. It's a pebble bed reactor, and that's 210 megawatts. That's in operation in Shandong. It's actually got 2 reactors and 1 steam turbine. So it's got 2 reactors running 1 steam turbine. So it's 105 megawatt per unit. That's running. The Korean 25 is 32 megawatts. It's a water-cooled one in Argentina. I'll show a picture of what that kind of machine looks like, and a lot of these are in that way. But Argentina's got massive financial problems, so it's been started and stopped several times, I think. So they've got a problem with the financing and we get it finished. China and Russia are now both building their next ones. The China is building an ACP 100, which is a water-cooled reactor, 125 megawatts. That should be coming online in 2025. And Russia is building a lead-cooled one. I haven't got an end date for that one, about 300 megawatts. And it's lead-cooled because lead has got a great heat transfer, so you can cool the core down very nicely in that. There's then a series of water-cooled designs, and NewScale and Smart and VK300 and BWX 300 and RTM 200, which is that RITM 200 is a better version of the KLT 40S. And those are all essentially water-cooled designs. And they're all in design, which means that they're still paper. So turning paper into reality for the first time can be very painful. Then there's one XE2 100, which is a USA gas-cooled reactor. In fact, the people doing that are all South Africans, or a lot of them South Africans from the PBMR project in South Africa. 4S is a Japanese liquid metal one. Again, 10 megawatts, the sizes down here. And then lastly, there's a lead bismuth design in Russia of 100 megawatts going forward. There are lots more design ones, but this is just an indication of the kind of things we're talking about. Very diverse, both in terms of power and in terms of technology, aiming for different niches. In other words, the 10 megawatt liquid metal one from 4S, which is a Japanese design, is looking for the remote village type thing where there's no grid, whereas the VK300 or the Brest 300 or are looking at BWX. They're all really looking at being grid machines. They're looking at being on the main grid and so on. A couple of existing, just so that they're real. These are the only 2 real ones in the world today. There's a few so there's two under construction. This is the floating nuclear power plant. This is on very north coast of Siberia. It's right around the corner, close towards the USA. And this is an industrial village and here. And this is, they had a small 33 megawatt nuclear power station in the village, and it was built in the 70s, and that's replaced by this, which is 2 35 megawatt reactors inside this barge, which is, and they do the barge simply because, again, they build the barge in St. Petersburg. They have the skills there, and they drag it around. It's easier to do that and build the hull than to try and build the whole plant in the middle of Siberia. Again, back to you. And the HTRPM is a pebble bed modular reactor. I'll show it a bit more of those in a second. It's running in China now, and it's essentially very similar to the South African high temp PBMR that was put forward thing. This is I'll put a standard. Most of the water-cooled reactors look a little bit like this, and this is not, they're not the same. What this is there, you've got a very tall, thin reactor. And rather than having, if you've seen pictures of Hinkley Point C, you will see reactor pressure vessel, you will see steam generators separately with pipes between them. You'll see a pressurizer, which is another vessel attached to it, and big pumps and everything else. This is how they're going towards it, and there are variations. This one is actually Empower, which is, so what happened is that to make the thing inherently safe, that is your reactor core, that bit of white at the bottom. and the whole thing's underwater. This is a steam void to keep the pressure up, which is a pressurizer. And then basically what happens is the water rises. In this case, it's actually, it rises up the center through the core, goes to the top, and then it comes down through the heat exchangers, which are here. That's why it's going from red to blue down here. Gets cold, comes down the bottom, goes round. So desperately passive. In some cases, they've got no pumps. In most cases, they've got some pumps, but the pump stopper keeps going. The actual pipe work is only these little pipes coming out the side here. You can see these pipes here, which are the feed connection and the steam connection. This is a generic one. But the problem is that the pressure vessel is very large compared to the fuel. And pressure vessels, nuclear pressure vessels, are expensive. So that's a sort of water core. Most of the water core ones look something like that. I'm not going to go down the details. And this is the a new scale design. And there you see the modules. And again, you see the concept of modules. You've got a pool of water which these all sit in. And therefore, basically, the ultimate heat cooling, if all else fails, is this pool of water. And you've got, and they're modular, and they just get plugged in like that. And you actually physically lift them and to refuel them, you move them to a refueling bay where they get refueled. So that's what modular means. Almost all of them are, to some extent, under at or below ground level. And they do promise much more safety, but the problem is the amount of physical steel in the pressure vessel is sort of dominating. Just quickly, PBMR was my project back in the 1995 through to 2005. This is a later version. Reactor pressure vessel, and it's a gas-cooled reactor, and the gas turbine is in the circuit. So in other words, your gas is coming out of the reactor, through the turbine, back through recuperators, and I won't bore you unless someone asks me, and then back to the compressors, and then it goes back to the recuperators and back into the reactor. Promises high efficiency, promises high temperatures, promises less equipment, because this is not the reactor system. This is the entire power station. That diagram is the power station. There is no steam turbine somewhere to crew the back of it. And this is how it's done. I'll show a picture of Pebble in a second, but it's a 6 centimeter graphite sphere which has embedded fuel particles in it, encased in silicon carbide. And what we had an annular core that is basically a cylindrical. There's a reflector. The reflector's aside there. This white in the middle is the core, and the middle was a central column in a reflector. And you basically had pebbles in here, and you extract pebbles at the bottom, and you recycle the pebbles if they're not fully burnt up, and the back and the top. And then your gas comes through the circuit. I won't bore you with any of that. We can go on. If somebody wants a 4-hour lecture, I'll do the lecture on Pebble. The nice thing about Pebble Reactor, I'll show you, and why they're so exciting. That's the fuel sphere, 6 centimeter. That's what it looks like. You cut it in half, and it's got inside little 1 millimeter diameter particles. That's the uranium dioxide kernel. And what's interesting is this is the pressure vessel. Safety. That's a safety case. The safety case is that 1 millimeter particle is like a Smartie. It's basically a series of wrappings, and it is incredibly robust. It will last up to over 1,500 degrees centigrade. So the design base says, if I turn off all the cooling, vent the gas, and walk away from it, the plant will heat up because of decay heat, but will never exceed the failure point of this fuel. Very interesting, very exciting works. Technically, they work. It's getting someone to finish them. And so the Chinese, the Chinese are doing this. They built and run their reactor. The South African one was put into mothballs in 2010 because of financial considerations. Not technical, not a business case, just anti-lobby. So some final thoughts, and I'm nearly at the hour, so I've got a bit longer. Hugo, I don't know how you wanted me to talk for. Two sets of thoughts. Let's go for a nuclear discussion. The first thought is simply, what are the safest and cleanest sources of energy in the world today? Now, this is a whole pile of data, and you can read the text below it. I'm sure it'll be Hugo puts that. If you want to know what kills people and what has greenhouse gas emissions, what you can see at the top of this thing is that coal, oil, and natural gas have significant, very significant emissions. And in fact, natural gas is understated here, because if you leak your methane, it actually, if you have a 5% leakage of your natural gas system, that's from the gas field all the way to the power station, and you're at 5% leakage, it's worse than coal, because although you're leaking not much gas, methane is 80 times worse than I think it's 80 times worse than over a 20-year period than CO2. Then you've got biomass, which is very debatable where it stands and where it comes to. I'm really not sure for those who, if anyone's from the UK, the Drax is shipping their biomass in from trees being felled in the USA and Canada, and I'm not sure how that works out to be environmentally benign. Hydropower, this number 34 tons is largely because of it's actually seen as rotting vegetation in the basin. In other words, that's the thing there. And then you've got nuclear and wind and solar. Nuclear is the least emitting, but the 3, 4, 5 tons, I'm not going to argue what the numbers are. In terms of deaths, including Chernobyl and Fukushima and everything else, that's the death toll. What you can see is biomass. Hydropower probably understates it, because when big dams fail, it gets really exciting. And there's been some really, really big dam failures historically. Shouldn't be any now. What you can see clearly is that there's a chunk down here which have exactly the same numbers, essentially. Of interest, solar here is understated. There's a funny reason for that. The Americans did a study. They have data on how often people fall off their roof and kill themselves in falling off their roof. And then someone sat down and worked out, given the number of hours people spend on the roof to maintain and install solar panels, you can work out how many deaths they cause per terawatt hour, and it's about 0.44, I think, or something. Pretty meaningless calculation, but it's quite funny to do that discussion. So, but that's worth. And the other answer is, well, okay, what's the real experience in the real world? And the answer is there are 8. Is this 8? I'm just counting numbers here. 7, I think, as well. Big grids that are low carbon and cost effective. In other words, they're not insane. Brazil, France, Ontario, Sweden, Switzerland, Finland, and Norway. And what you can see quite clearly is that the answer to the question of how you make these things work is you either have large hydro or you have nuclear, and everything else is noise. Nobody has created a credible utility based on renewables at a real cost. And the best example to quote that with you before I just finish the presentation is Hawaii. Everyone says, well, give me faith, we can make renewables and batteries and everything else work. Well, Hawaii's got lots of money. It's very warm, it's sunny, and it's got good winds because it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And they're 80% fueled by diesel fuel. And if you believe renewables should hack it, then Hawaii should be all renewable. And even more than that, it's on. I think its price is average twice that of the average US electricity price. Okay, so with that, I think that's my last slide. Thank you. I'm going to pass back and stop share. I'll leave the sharing on just a question. I'll pass back to Hugo. Hugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. If anyone's got a question, raise your hands. There's another Hugo took my name in the chat. I suppose he can be first. You know who that is? One of the panelists raised their hands. Just ask them to unmute. And then if anyone else has got a question, just raise your hand or type the question. I can give you power to speak. So the person who has raised their hand, they can speak.
Hi, Hugo, this is Rajiv here. David, thank you for the capsule of vitamin N. It was really compressed, but such an enlightening.
Go for days if you want me to.
Having worked in the nuclear sector for almost close to 19 years, it was really enriching attending your presentation. Thank you very much. No, I had just two things which always run into my mind. One is countries are trying to export nuclear power. Like for example, France is trying to set up this power plants in India, the ones at Jaitapur in Maharashtra. So what I want to ask is, what measures is the nuclear bodies of the world, like IAEA or the WANO or all such international bodies, what is being discussed in the context of internationalization and so that the power plant which is constructed, let us say in France, it can be easily sold in India as well without much of discussion and debate by the regulator in India on whether it conforms to the national regulations or how safe it is, and all these questions which go around with the design of a nuclear power plant. What is your take on it?
It's an incredibly important question, incredibly difficult question. I mean, it's one of the big challenges. Nuclear power, and I was having a discussion today with some guys at the conference on exactly this topic, because nuclear power has historically always been seen as a national competence in terms of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of an international standard has always been sort of said about, but it's not really there. And I'll be honest, IAEA has international standards, but they're the lowest possible common denominator, because they need they need everybody in the IAEA to agree to them, because it's a consensus organization, and that means that the person who's got a design that isn't very good doesn't want a very high standard in the process. That's a bit unfair, I know, but that's the way it is. I answer the question for me in two ways. One is, it is difficult to handle that, and it's one of the biggest problems. If I look at the costing structure, I mentioned earlier when I was looking at the cost of the export models going out today, Hungary has been a major challenge for the Russians in terms of costing, because what you've got to do, in my opinion, when you import a nuclear reactor, you've got to, if you're importing a reactor, you're importing it from a credible country.
Mm-hmm.
By definition, if the country is not credible, you wouldn't be importing the reactor. You know, I hope there are no North Koreans in this meeting. But if somebody says I'm going to use a North Korean reactor, I would question. Just generally, I'd say, excuse me, you're going to buy a reactor which we have no idea if it's good or bad, because the North Korean standards are not understood. But if you're buying a Russian or a Chinese or an Indian or anybody's reactor nowadays, you're probably going to be saying, I'll buy it from you because you're credible. In doing so, what you've got to do then is say, I will accept your codes and standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking about, again, so we're talking about this with our regulator, and I'm saying, I've said for years, I've said, if South Africa buys a nuclear reactor, imports one, we have already agreed and got broad understanding that we will accept the codes and standards of the country of origin. However, we would then review those codes and standards, and we might add some extra requirements to it. We wouldn't turn around to a plant built by to DIN standards in Germany and say, you must now supply it to us in ASME standards, which is what some people have done. And that just means you've got to re-engineer the whole plant, because the changes are minor, but they're pervasive. So that's the other thing, you do a strong QC, because you've got to make sure that country can have standards, but you've got to really have on your table with inspections. So those are the two things, and you can see it in things like the Hungarian nuclear deal in Europe, where quite simply, as I understand it, the plant's costing about 25% more than other Russian export machines, because they're having to look at re-engineering. And Hinkley Point C apparently has things like the UK fire regulations are different to the French fire regulations, so they had to re-engineer the building for fire systems. It means that all the civil works are re-engineered and redone. Opposite answer, when we bought Koeberg in South Africa in 1976, our Factories Act, which is the people who run the industrial standards for safety, issued a letter to Eskom which said, anything which is under the nuclear regulator, we will accept as reasonable.
Yeah. In fact, I was about to come to this, and you touched precisely the same point. Now, I'm like, one of the key areas of concern when we are discussing with the Indian client, which is Nuclear Power Corporation, is the compliance to the atomic energy factory rules in the Indian context, vis-a-vis what is followed on the EPR, which is a French thing. So basic regulation in terms of the staircase height, the number of staircases for fire exit, the spacing, these are all becoming big bottlenecks. And if we try to comply the EPR to this, it will result in a complete different layout of the EPR.
Yeah. And my answer to that question is you've got to start out with a fundamental statement. When you do your initial selection of who could be suppliers, you say, and I say, this is a country I think is reasonable. They've got different ways of doing things to us, but normally you find swings and roundabouts. And so but you can't adopt, and we did this to some extent, you can't adopt, for example, and I use Germany because that's the KTA and the DIN standards are well known. They don't build nuclear power stations, but you cannot turn around and say, I'm going to build my power station to a DIN or KTA mechanical design and then apply US ASME 11 inspection criteria.
Yeah,
it doesn't really work. You suddenly find that the RPV, the assumption that I'm going old. I know there's no German nuclear power
Can
station.
I just interrupt because we have a lot of questions coming.
Oh, sorry, Hugo.
Just
You're
thank
in
you for that
charge.
question, Rajiv. And
Thank you, Rajiv. I'm shutting up now.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Next question, Timothy Lorcan, I'd like to give you an opportunity.
Sorry about the noise in the background. Neighbours drilling. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. My question is twofold. What's the prospects of renewables in Africa in general? But Germany trying to outsource solar energy and then ship it back. That spark something in Africa, maybe, or is it SMRs which are the future? How does that fit with the unstable geopolitics? I believe South Africa is basically the only nuclear capable country in Africa at the moment.
Okay, you've asked a whole can of worms there. Look, I mean, renewables are taking a significant impact into Africa, and in South Africa particularly because of political problems in the past and policy decisions that we made to go free market in our power system back in 1990s. We've got a massive shortage of power. I'd go on for another complete lecture. But so individually, rich people are putting in solar panels and batteries and diesel generators because we became like not as bad as Nigeria, but we're moving that way. There is an enormous political pressure by the businessmen who do projects to actually go for renewables because they're nice chunk-sized things that they actually can finance and get power purchase agreements from the state and those kind of things. Having said that, there is a pretty large pushback which says this is not really helping much. So it's a rather confused answer. But my real answer, can I get a different answer to you, which is I think the speed at which technology changes. When technology changes and the economics change properly, then adoption becomes really quick. Look at cell phones across Africa. I know it sounds a discussion, but Africa is totally covered by cell phones nowadays, coverage. And that's because it was a real technological change. In fact, most African countries have completely missed out landlines. They've gone straight from men with split sticks and messages all the way to cell phones in one step. That's been going fine to my friends back home. But the fact is that we haven't seen the mini grid discussion of, oh, you're going to buy a mini grid for your village and you're going to put some solar panels and a battery and a small diesel. If that was economically the best way to go, it would be happening en masse. It's actually not happening that much. It's being supported en masse, but it's not happening. So I don't think, and there was increasing pushback. I mean, there was a lot of memes in South Africa going around about the Germans are very keen for us to stop using coal so they can buy it and burn it themselves. Type of discussions. But yeah, it's a pressure. We have a new energy policy coming out literally, I believe, next week for comment. It could be a bit later, but and I believe that will move us back into a more classical approach, which will largely say that coal's got to keep running, that we need natural gas as a bridge to the future, but that the future is nuclear.
Next question from Jesse.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello. My name is Jesse. Thank you very much, Debbie, for this insightful presentation. My question goes like this. From your slide about the cost of setting up a power plant, I noticed that in Hungary, it costs $14 billion to set up a 1,100 megawatts capacity.
No, it was.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
exactly
here. So in Hungary, it costs $14 billion to set up 1100 megawatts of electricity.
Times 2.
Whereas for the same capacity, it costs twice that amount in Egypt. So I was wondering what could be the reason.
You're misreading it. The capacity is the capacity of each machine.
Oh, okay.
So Hungary has got 2,200. Egypt's got 4,400.
Oh, okay. I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So,
it makes sense.
it was a machine size.
All right.
What's interesting is just that, and one of the problems with this kind of assessment, because you can't get the contracts. You know, I mean, we've asked people, economic people have said, can we have a copy of what the contract covers? You know, and you find things like the UAE is a good example. We know the UAE one, which is now online, has includes the first initial core and 3 reloads of fuel.
Okay.
So that, and it's quite normal. So that actually includes the fuel for the first 6 years, 18 months, 7.5 years operation is included in the capital cost. You get people, I think it's the Egyptians who have asked the Russians to run or certainly the Bangladesh has asked the Russians to actually run the reactor for the first year and then hand it over to them. So in that cost, presumably includes O&M and staffing for the first year. So you've got to work out you don't know what's in these contracts. So it's a very rough and ready, you know, but it is true to say that the costs vary. And the other thing you're seeing is if I'm being simplistic, I would argue that the actual material cost of ideal construction for a current nuclear plant, and the inflation is about $2,000 a kilowatt.
Okay.
The rest of the money is setting up is licensing. So if you get to the nth machine, like the Chinese have got to with the CPR thousands, and like the French got to with their 900 megawatt and 1,200 megawatt series back in the past, you will get down to about $2,000 a kilowatt, because you will not need to repeat the training, because you've got a training department. You will not need to repeat building simulators. You'll not need to repeat doing all the procedure writing. And that's one of the key things we've already learned, is that the American problem going back into the 80s, when their program was a disaster in the mid 80s in the US, was because all the machines were different. Every utility has one machine and was doing all its overheads. So the trick is the overheads.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Yes, yeah. Next person, David Woodhouse.
Hi, David.
Yeah.
Very interesting talk. I've got a couple of questions, but the first would be just Hinkley Point C, I think it is, from your talk. How does the time for completion compare with on your graph? You know, you showed 5 years.
I think the answer is pretty awful.
Yes, that's my impression.
It is important to understand that the problem, my answer is, as Eskom, I was running the procurement process, because we've been in a semi-procurement process sometime trying to get to the point of ordering. And we'd written down the criteria, and there were 5 key criteria that we put down for the nuclear plant we want to buy, right? And let's try this on you, David, if I may. The first one is, you have got a reference machine, something you have just built or are still building, and we want that. We will list the variations. There'll be about a dozen variations that we want because of certain things, but essentially we want that. I had to explain to a Frenchman once that when I said the same, I meant if the power station manager's office in the reference machine was painted pink, we wanted the same shade of pink, right? You've got to be pedantic about it, that you have the same machine. So you then have an advantage because your specification becomes much simpler, because you're buying it from a credible supplier. So if you're buying an EPR, you say, now, EPR is interesting. You might say, I want Taishan. I'll take Taishan with these changes, and only those changes. That's the first thing I must say. So I want real reference. Second one is, I want some proof that in the last 10 years, you've completed a nuclear plant of this size and scale, roughly on budget and time. I accept some projects run over for reasons that nobody can explain, but if you've never built a machine on schedule and time in your life, or in the last 20 years, it worries me, because your team is not set up to do it. Third one is we want you to have some experience in the export market. Now, the French have experience in the export market, but I was saying these are my 5 things. And that means that you've previously gone and you've previously worked in a foreign country and realize it's not the same as home. Because what you often find is when you get, it's a first export market, they assume either it's the same as Mother Russia or whatever where they come from, or they assume that it's that everything is unavailable. And there's the fourth one is there is a domestic build program, so that when you've got a problem, you've got some resources to go back on. At Koeberg, for example, we rejected one of the steam generators because it had a twist in it. I'm going back to the late 70s, early 80s. We rejected that SG. And because the French then had a production line making SGs for their fleet, they could say, okay, we'll swap every one of these. But if you're the only one they're building, then they built 3 SGs for you and one of them's rejected, they've got to build another SG, which is 18 months. So schedule-wise. And the last one is you want the country that's supplying it to you to have total control of the intellectual property they're using to supply it. So because you've got to stay friendly with the country you're buying it from. Yep. I'm sure the English and the French that's difficult. But you've got to stay friendly with the country you're buying it from. And that relationship has to be in place for a long time. Now, if there's another country involved that's providing IP to the project, you've now got 3 relationships to maintain. You're friendly with them, you're friendly with the other country, and you don't be sanctioned. So you want to get down. Those are my sort of 5 rules. You will note they do not discuss the design of the reactor core at all.
Yep.
But if you fail one of those, it's not absolute, but if you don't have one of those to some extent, you end up saying, and I think therefore I would say at the moment that you're committed to Hinkley Point C in UK. Finish it. It's going to be okay. It'll be a great station when it's built, like Taishan in China. You know, maybe late, but it's great. But Sizewell C will be straightforward, unless somebody decides they're going to change Sizewell C because of some reason they've not yet thought of. And in fact, that's the problem with the British advanced gas reactors. Every single site was different to the last site. Mm-hmm. They were getting more perfect all the time and just being late, and not working. Sorry, does that answer the question, David?
Well, yes. I was hoping you'd tell me.
Look, I haven't.
When exactly, but that's no. That does, it explains it. And of course, what goes through my mind is from construction. You know, I think many of us know if you do change something once you've started. Everything is up for grabs. Suddenly time and budget is out of the window and you're struggling to get it back. I have one other question, David, if I might put it to you. On the question of renewables, you really have impressed me with the logic of nuclear power. There's talk, of course, now of battery storage. A further sort of sophistication and no doubt expense in grids and so on. But isn't that going to make renewables a bit more filling in your duck graph, coming in at the right time?
Oh, David, you've opened a can of worms here. Let me ask a question, David. Do you drive a motor car?
I do. It's a petrol one.
Right. Thank you. No,
not electric one.
Okay. Would you agree that motor car companies are prepared to be quite high tech? I drive a Volvo XC90, right? Mm-hmm. And it talks to me and it does all kinds of things. It's got a touch screen and everything else. Mm. So would you agree that car companies are prepared to be high tech as required? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that car companies are trying to cut every pound they can off the price of a car?
Yes. In a competitive market.
So the battery in your car, David, must be the highest tech, lowest cost battery you can possibly get. Yes?
Yes, of course.
What technology is a battery in your car?
Oh, I assume it's lead acid. I have really, it works.
When was lead acid invented?
Oh, I don't know. With the Model T, was it?
No. 1859.
Yes.
Mm. So in terms of battery technology movement, we are Still not yet. I mean, somebody may along can bring their little Toyota, whatever, with a start. I mean, clearly, electric cars have let us have
lithium, do they?
because of mass density, but you don't. So the answer to the question is, you've now got a stage where your lithium-ion battery is now 80% of the cost of that is material cost that is a function of the cost of, it's a commodity cost coming into it. So that we understand the chemistry of batteries and have done since the 1800s.
Yep.
So whatever we've got today is it. Now, if you then Eskom, now just if you do the calculations on a level on a cost of a grid system, the price at which battery storage starts really changing the picture, in the sense that what you're talking about is between $50 and $100 a kilowatt hour storage. Right? Okay. Battery energy storage systems, which are large and have got economies of scale without question, we're just putting one in South Africa, and we're coming in at figures of around $400+ a kilowatt hour. So with 85% of the cost being fixed to the price of input materials, and therefore not learnable, we are still functioning at something like 6 times the price at which it makes sense. So you're required to change. I personally have more faith in fusion working than cheap batteries. So no, batteries are good. And that's why hydrogen is now so exciting. Everyone's realizing batteries don't work. So they're now declaring another source to solve intermittency as hydrogen. Yes?
Right. Yep.
The hydrogen economy, anyone who does any economics on it will tell you it's not going to work. I'll give you an example. They say, oh, there's so much hydrogen made in the world nowadays, we can use that as a baseline. Yes, virtually every hydrogen plant on Earth is linked right next to the chemical works it feeds. The extreme example being Sasol in South Africa at Secunda, which is a massive oil from coal plant. Makes 40% of the South African petrol. But it's a Fischer-Tropsch process. But that's not transporting hydrogen around the world. People say, oh, it can go in the pipelines with the natural gas. Excuse me, its energy density by volume is about 1/3 of that of natural gas. So you've got to have 3 times the pressure or 3 times the volume. And anyway, hydrogen also is a good cracking material on some metals. So no, hydrogen's going nowhere. But it's part of the thing of how do you solve intermittency? And you solve intermittency by having something that can store energy. If batteries don't hack it, then we'll go to hydrogen. But that's not going to, the hydrogen economy myth will disappear in the next couple of years as well. Am I being harsh enough?
Well, you're very clear, David.
And I mean, someone says to me, what happens if the world changes? And my answer is, well, that's fine. I'm semi-retired. I don't play the lotto, but assume I played the lotto. In my plan for my retirement, I have not got a statement which says, if I will win the lotto, and therefore I plan on that.
Yep.
If I was to win the lotto, I would change my retirement plan. In the same way as if someone tomorrow morning comes to and says, we've got a 10 megawatt fusion reactor that actually works and is credible and makes power and is cost effective, that will change everything very quickly. I'm not sure I'm convinced it'll happen, but we must plan the future based on what we know. We can't gamble on an invention we haven't got yet for the future of civilization.
Yep.
I'm going to lead you just one comment, which I think will be the last comment for the evening. It's from Ian Gillis, where he wrote it. So he says, thank you, Dave, for an interesting presentation. I spent a couple of years around 1970 in South Africa for Marconi supplied radar system. My impression then was of an enthusiastic but somewhat naive customer. How does the South African expertise in nuclear technology now compare to that of the rest of the world?
I'm going to a couple of comments. I started the PBMR project, which was a gas graphite plant, helium coated particle fuel direct cycle gas turbine plant in 1995, essentially. And by 2000, we were seen internationally, and we still are seen as some of the world experts in that field. I mean, we stopped the project, but we're still in. I'll give you a couple of examples. I think we're pretty good. I think we can do it quite comfortably. I must give a couple of sales pitches on us. We've run my NECSA, which is what I'm chair, provides 20% of the world's radiopharmaceuticals from our research reactor at Safari, which actually Safari is the reactor's name. It's not on Safari. It's a Safari core reactor. And that machine is that we think by statistics is the best performing research reactor in the world. It's over 300 days a year on load, which is for research reactors amazing. We do have ASME 3 accreditation for our fabrication. We have an N stamp. So I don't think, I'm not too fussed. If I give another answer, when the UAE's, when the Abu Dhabi nuclear plant had some problems, they recruited people overseas, and they recruited about 140 from South Africa, from Koeberg. And they're now, I think most of the unit managers are South African. I just today met the engineering services manager, and he's South African. I know the head of safety is South African. I know the head of the psychological evaluation is South African. So it's a very, we're not too bad. We're in the nuclear team in the world is a nuclear team in the world. You don't play in this game unless you're okay. And we're running 2 reactors, and we just changed ESGs, and we're running a pretty good research facility. So I think we're okay.
All right. Well, Dave, that was the last question of the evening. On behalf of the Institute of Civil Engineering in France, and yes, the entire team, I'd like to thank you for making time for this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed your short trip to France. Next time we'll do this in person.
Hugo, I will tell you now, this is the least exciting trip to France. I mean, the professional bit was great. I have arrived in the airport. I've taken a bus to the hotel, and I've taken a bus every morning out to the exhibition center around the corner and back. And that's my entire view of France. Besides that, it rains here as well. I know why I live in South Africa. It's warmer out there. But yes, it's fun. And I'm very glad to meet you yesterday. It was nice to put and you now know how tall I am.
Yes, that's right. Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending, and thanks again, Dave. And I suppose that's all for the evening. And we'll send the recording. We'll manage it like last time, and the presentation slides will also be available. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, so much for your presentation.